Their market's been decimated in the last 6 weeks or so. Hi everyone, this is Matthew Kruse with Comstock Investments. Just going to give you kind of a brief market update for the growing season here in the United States and what we're seeing going on in Brazil. First, starting out with weather, it's still what is moving the markets. Over the weekend, obviously, I think most people have heard about our B-2 stealth bombers bombing nuclear sites in Iran. And I think on Sunday, the market was there's a lot of chatter that we're expecting a lot of volatility and turmoil with crude oil prices rising, and that didn't really happen. For the most part, the market kind of shrugged it off. I think a lot of that's just because they were expecting more retaliation, or there was initial fear of retaliation, and I think we've come to see there's, at least in the short term, we're not expecting much. The response for some of those missile strikes from Iran was pretty insignificant, and they had even called ahead to our U.S. Counterparts, warning them that we're firing these missiles now, so take cover. And so it gave them plenty of time. So the market, starting Monday, has drifted lower and has actually broken through some of its short-term support levels at 433 3/4 in new crop. You kind of see here the forecast looking at least through June 29th is pretty heavy rainfall, up to 2 to 4 inches in greater parts of at least the upper half of the growing region. As you get over into parts of Illinois, it's maybe a little bit less, but there's still plenty of scattered showers in parts of the eastern Corn Belt of 1/2 inch to an inch in a lot of areas. And I know I've talked to growers in southern Illinois that were extremely wet, and so having the rainfall ease off quite a bit may be welcome for some people. I drove from Des Moines to Minneapolis over the weekend, and crops overall look great along I-35, but it wasn't hard to, miss some of the standing water puddles in some of the fields. And so it indicates that, fields are very well saturated, have plenty of water, at least in that growing central region of Iowa, but there's more water on the way. And so the market is, in some cases, you could argue it might be too much rainfall, but I think the market is still going to continue to operate with the mindset that rain makes grain, and the market is forward looking and looking out ahead into early part of July. They still sees favorable growing conditions, and that's going to continue to kind of weigh heavy on the market here. But we're not doing too much right now. Market's just down a penny in new crop, but it's down 5 1/4 in soybeans. So looking out ahead to July, this is obviously not quite as accurate, but we're kind of on the precipice here of July, and we do see that every place generally leans a little bit drier, except maybe some of the distant areas in the eastern Corn Belt, like Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. Those areas still have meeting their average or slightly above average for rainfall. But you look at Iowa and kind of surrounding areas in southern Minnesota and South Dakota, you're maybe an inch below what the average is. This is just a 30-day weather anomaly. An inch below average doesn't mean drought or anything like that. It's just, instead of, if your average is 4 inches, you're going to get 3 inches. Now, considering how wet we are in a lot of areas, that's probably a welcome thing. So that, looking at this forecast, which again, these longer term forecasts aren't near as accurate, in my opinion, this might be a generally favorable thing. But a lot of it's going to come down to the temperatures. We obviously had a pretty extreme heat event over the weekend with temperatures in the upper 90s in a lot of areas in the Midwest. But I think we've come out of that now, and it didn't last very long. Probably dried up some areas that needed to be dried up, and now we're back to being in kind of mostly the 80s for the most part. So, the managed money for the most part continues to be net short. And I think that's, some might argue, well, that if they're that heavily net short, I think around 180,000 contracts might, lead to some sort of tripping the trigger of them getting out and taking their profits. But we kind of need something for that to happen, to take place, for that to happen. And, bombing Iran didn't work. And so it could be that there might be some information in the acreage report coming out next Monday that could account for that. There's a lot of, I think the market is being set up to be, they're looking for an increase in acres, additional increase in acres of 95.3 million is the last acreage report that we had in March. And so if we see something closer to 96 million. That obviously would be the worst case scenario. I personally kind of think that we're probably looking at a modest increase in acres, but maybe continued reduction in quarterly stocks just due to strong demand, old crop exports. And so possibly you're going to see the increase in production for next year be offset by increased demand and lower ending stocks from last year. The worst case scenario would be where we don't see an increase in exports, but we do see that increase in acres. And so time will tell here shortly. But shifting over to Brazil, they're still in the initial stages of their second crop harvest, and their safrinha, or second crop corn, is their principal crop in Brazil, and it's what we compete with for the most part because it's what the crop that they export. And so it's starting out slow, behind schedule, about half of what it was last year, or in the 5-year average, I should say, where they've had about 20% complete by this time, and they're only about 10%. So there's still time for them to catch up. Usually around that July 8th period is when they reach that halfway point, but their crops have taken a lot longer to kind of dry down, and they don't have a lot of drying capacity on the farm, and they're not looking to get any additional dockage by making those deliveries now. And so they're just letting it dry out in the field. And so they'll get it out eventually, but it's just taking longer to dry down. I think you're going to start to see that harvest ratchet up here pretty soon, but it may still end on time there, kind of early part of August. Taking into consideration what Brazil's corn production has done, there's this idea that, as Brazil's crop continues to grow, and it has, and steadily and probably significantly, that's just going to lead to massive increases in exports. And obviously you can see kind of the 10-year trend that is up. And so that is happening, but probably not at the rate that people think. Some of the research I've done looking at the 22-23 season, where they had a record season and they actually displaced the United States as the largest corn exporter in the world. They exported 52 million metric tons. I see that a little bit more as an outlier going forward. I don't expect that, just because Brazil's domestic consumption is growing at the same pace, more or less, than what their corn production has. And so it doesn't mean that they still aren't going to be competitive. It doesn't mean that their exports can't continue to grow over time, but it also makes me think that, they're not going to have this excessive production like what they had in the 22-23 season. A lot of that has to do just because their corn ethanol industry is starting to come online. There's already 20, 25 plants that are in production, another 15 that are expected to come online in the next year or two. And so as that industry matures, it's going to consume more of their corn domestically, and I think we'll kind of keep a lid on their exports. And so that's what you kind of look at for this 24-25 season, in the upper almost 40 million metric tons. I think they could probably be a little bit higher than that, probably in the low to mid 40s actually this year. But looking out ahead to next year, we kind of see the production estimates begin to level off while their domestic consumption continue to increase. And that basically means that there'll be less corn for exports. And so longer term, that's a good thing for U.S. producers. It could mean that we're just going to have to compete more on the ethanol side, which is kind of a whole different situation where we start having discussions on SAF and things of that nature. But looking ahead to the overall production in Brazil, you kind of see that what the production has done here, and they're looking at the 5.1 billion bushels of overall production. That's based on around almost just under 53 million acres for this season. And so obviously, yes, they are increasing their acres over the years. You can see that. But you look out over the last 20 years, they've added, about 22 million acres, and so that's a big increase, but from year to year, it's not that huge. The thing that I would point out, that I like to point out a lot of times, is this 5 billion bushels, it's a third of what the U.S. crop is, but it's also based off of pretty low yields. Like we're targeting, 181 bushels per acre for our national yield in the United States, where they're targeting, 94 bushels. And so they're basically getting half a yield. What happens, they could add 1 billion bushels to the crop just by increasing their yield by 20 bushels, which is certainly possible given, improved seed genetics and a good growing season. The point is there's just a lot of potential there. It's kind of the breakdown of that crop. They have 3 crops there. And you kind of see their first crop in that blue is really kind of flatline. They're gotten a little bit smaller, but going back 20 years ago, that was their principal crop. And it's grown more predominantly in the South and is used for feed, and almost none of it is exported. Now, all their growth is coming from that second crop, which is what is being harvested now and is really shot up here. There is a third crop, but it's pretty insignificant. But Conab likes to differentiate just because it's planted in a different growing season, but it also has some potential too. So, maybe in 5 years it'll be 200 or 300 million bushels instead of 100 million bushels, but it's still pretty insignificant. But most of that growth is coming from that right now. I didn't take the effort to kind of translate this into dollars per bushel, but that Mato Grosso at 40 reais, this is a chart showing what the cash price for corn has done in Mato Grosso. You kind of see basically in the month of May, cash prices collapse as the harvest approached and the size of record potential size of that crop starts to become more known. And that 40 reais per day, I calculated, would be around 309 or 310 per bushel. And so not that long ago, they had, I want to say like 530 cash corn. And you can just see that their market's been decimated in the last 6 weeks or so, that it's collapsed. And so it's also not great for our prices here, because they're more competitive, obviously, delivering corn on the global market at deflated prices. It makes our prices tough to increase as well. And so this is pretty seasonal, and kind of be expected. But just the decline and how quickly and swiftly that happened, that I thought was notable, and it's probably going to languish there for a little while. But once they get past harvest and made a lot of those deliveries, I think you'll see the price begin to recover again. It's just pretty scary how much that the price there domestically in Brazil has collapsed for them. So that's all I have for you today, and let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email us, and we can respond to some of those questions. Thank you.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.